Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Dr. Lewis Pearson. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy here at the University of St. Francis. This is the title of my talk, and I was hoping to get one more plug in for the university and my department right before we began. Mine is one of a series of lectures that our department is giving, and if you go to St. Francis's website, find our department, you'll just find it's easy to find the list of lectures, when they're happening and where they're happening. So please feel free to continue to come to these, a varied assortment of topics that we cover. And today I'm going to be talking about faith and reason and why it is most people don't understand either one. Well, thanks to everyone for coming this afternoon. First, I'd like to start just by asking some general questions. Any reason why you were interested in coming out today? How is it you found out about this? Anybody find out about this from Today's Catholic? I think it was advertised there. Anyone find out about it from a contact on campus? From a class? From a friend who goes to a class here? All right. From the flyer. From the flyer, all right. Anyone tell me why you thought it might be interesting to come to this talk today? And extra credit is an all right answer if that's the reason. Anyone? Sister Anita.
Well, faith and reason is a part of our mission statement. So I wanted to hear what you have to say about their interaction and their misunderstandings in regard to what we're trying to do here at the university.
Mm-hmm. All right. Anyone else? That's a very good reason to do it. Yes?
I would just like to stay updated in the theology of what's happening more recently in this field, because it comes up all the time with some of the non-Catholic adults that I deal with.
Okay, sure. What's your name?
Sister Angelina.
Sister Angelina? Okay, thank you for that reason. Well, you'll find today I'm not going to be catching you up on the theology so much as I'm going to be catching you up on popular culture.
But it's under that umbrella.
Yes, sister. I don't want to take up too much time. I'm just going to jump into things. So I'd like to start with reflection, a reading from the Gospel of Mark. This is chapter 12, beginning with verse 28. And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, asked him, "Which commandment is first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." And the scribe said to him, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and that there is no other but he. And to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself, is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices." And when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." All right, I gave a brief outline so you can have a sort of a feel for how far along we are in today's lecture. We're already done with the first part. The second part, I just wanted to cut to the chase and tell you where I am so you're not wondering basically where I'm going to be coming down with respect to faith and reason today. I'm basically going to be reaffirming the Catholic tradition that faith and reason are both integral parts of a fully lived human life. One way to summarize this is to read to you the opening greeting from John Paul II's Fides et Ratio. This is Latin for faith and reason. "Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know truth, in a word, to know himself. So that by knowing and loving God, men and women may also come to the fullness of truth about themselves. So if you want a good primer on the Catholic intellectual tradition regarding faith and reason and how they're connected, you can take a look at these paragraphs from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. They're not long. Or Pope John Paul II's encyclical letter, which I just read the greeting from, a little longer, a little over 100 pages. You can read the decrees of the First Vatican Council, which were specifically about faith and reason and their relation to one another. And it's not a long list of decrees. And for those who want more advanced reading, you can pick up St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, the high points of theology. And this is so when you go home today and tell people what you heard, you have some fancy words, pars prima secundae. These are all just the ways of referring to the part of his book. But you can go online, there are free public domain translations of the Summa. And these questions 62 to 67, discuss the nature of faith and reason. But I said these are, for people who are a bit advanced in your study of theology, they will presuppose an understanding of Aristotle's account of the human soul and how moral and intellectual virtues perfect that soul. So a few of you who have taken my ethics class, who've got that account of the soul, would be able to read these questions. All right. So I'm not going to be, as I said, going over this, just affirming this is the Catholic tradition. Faith and reason go hand in hand. They're both modes of knowing. But if you'd like to know more about it, these are places you can look. Any questions so far? All right. Now to the meat of the lecture. I'm going to talk about faith first, and then I'm going to talk about reason. One of the problems that we have when we talk about faith with people, in passing, talk about it with people that we know closely, bless you, but we talk about it right before we establish our terms, is faith can mean several different things. And here are three common meanings of the word faith. Faith as a shorthand for the deposit of faith. Faith as a theological virtue. And faith as trust. I'll talk about each one of these in turn. Faith as a shorthand for the deposit of faith. This is when people say, keep the faith, right? Faith of our fathers, that sort of thing. This is the faith that was the shorthand for the deposit of faith, meaning the truths revealed by Jesus and through Jesus in his incarnation, death, resurrection, handed on to the apostles. The apostles are commissioned by Jesus and confirmed by the Holy Spirit at Pentecost to be the church of God. And this church is protected through time in the preservation and promulgation of that deposit of faith. So things like the infallibility of the magisterium and papal infallibility are doctrines that are actually tied to the protection the church has given by the Holy Spirit in preserving this deposit of faith. We won't be talking about that. This is a specific use of the word faith that people mean when they say things like, keep the faith. Another sense of the word faith is the theological virtue. So here's an example. You may be familiar with this passage from 1 Corinthians. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not charity, I am nothing. This is the theological virtue of faith. This is a virtue as a perfection, something that makes us fully what we are supposed to be. And as one of the three theological virtues, it's one that perfects us supernaturally, that's infused by God. I'm not going to be talking about this theological virtue. By the way, if you didn't know, faith, hope, and charity are the three theological virtues, which St. Paul tells us just a few lines later in 1 Corinthians. What I will be talking about today is faith as trust. Trust meaning a prerequisite disposition for knowing. Right? It's something you have to have first as an attitude before you can come to know something. If you have no trust in the person you're about to ask a question of, there's a very small likelihood that you'll actually gain anything from the answer that person might give. But this kind of trust, faith as trust, is what we'll be talking about today. So here's a passage from the New Testament which seems like the kind of meaning of faith as trust that Jesus uses. Then as he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand, and place it in my side. Do not be faithless, but believing." The reason I'm discussing this version of faith, it's because it's the most generic meaning, faith as trust. And as the generic meaning, first, it's the one that a lot of people misunderstand today. And second, if you misunderstand the generic meaning, you'll also misunderstand the specific meanings. So the two meanings that are shorthand for, say, the deposit of faith and faith as a theological virtue are actually specific applications of our understanding of faith in general as this disposition of knowing, this faith as trust. Okay, so I've been saying people misunderstand faith today. This is basically what I mean. People say, I believe something on faith. Usually it just boils down to something this simple. I believe whatever I want. Right? And for this reason, it seems irrational. It seems very non-binding, meaning I could have faith in something, but it doesn't mean anyone else has to, because it's just what I want to believe. So people often use faith in this way to say, this is what I think, and you can't tell me I'm wrong, because I have faith in it. So I want to read from a textbook. This is a textbook. It's supposed to be an introduction to philosophy. It has its merits, but as far as understanding faith, it's horrible. That said, I think it was helpful for me. I once taught from this textbook about 4 years ago, and when I started reading what the authors were saying, I thought, I cannot believe this made it to print. But I think the reason it made it to print is because they were explaining what a lot of people think faith is today. And so when people, like the editors and later on teachers and students, read it, they thought, oh, of course, this is faith. So this is from Doing Philosophy, 4th edition, by Theodore Schick Jr. and Louis Vaughan. This is in a chapter about faith and belief. Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard was particularly troubled by the Christian belief that an immortal being, God, became mortal, Jesus Christ. Kierkegaard writes that in which, accordant with its nature, is eternal, comes into existence in time, is born, grows up, and dies. This is a breach with all thinking. How could something that is the creator of all things, including space and time, become bounded by space and time? How can the eternal become temporal, the infinite become finite? It doesn't seem to make sense. Schick and Vaughan pick up after Kierkegaard here. So difficult is this notion to comprehend that Kierkegaard labeled it as, quote, absurd. It has long been known that many of the Christian dogmas are incompatible with reason. News to me. They continue. Ordinarily, that would be grounds for rejecting them. For the more unreasonable a claim, the less reason there is for believing it. In the case of religious claims, however, some apologists argue the opposite. Carthaginian theologian Tertullian, for example, says of the Incarnation, "It is to be believed because it is absurd." Here, absurdity becomes a reason for belief, and Kierkegaard agrees. By the way, this isn't exactly what Tertullian means, but that's what he's being used to say here. Kierkegaard says, quote, "The absurd is the object of faith and the only object that can be believed." Kierkegaard takes this attitude toward the absurd because faith requires passion, and only that which is contrary to reason can be believed passionately. Now, I'd like to walk with this microphone, but I'm going to be stuck back here because it's tied down. I'm going to walk out and see if I can... Can you still hear me all right if I raise my voice this way? All right, this is more natural for me, and I'm still recording, so the video is fine. But this is the problem. If I have to believe something on faith, it means I have to believe it because it's not reasonable. Reason gives me justification and a foundation for saying this is true. But the moment I don't have reason to back me, I can still say it's true because I believe it passionately enough. And this is what these textbook authors are saying faith is. And they're saying Christian theologians and Protestant theologians, Tertullian, an early theologian, to Kierkegaard, a later Protestant theologian. These textbook authors are saying, yeah, the Christians themselves have it as a point of pride that I have to believe it on the point of faith because it's irrational. And so I found, actually, to my mild horror when I started teaching this section in a class years ago, that a lot of students said, yeah, that's what faith is. Now, if this is what faith is, right, we've already lost the game. This is what faith is. If I believe it's strong enough, it's true. It's just weird. I mean, if not clearly outright false. If I believe strongly enough, $1 million will show up in my bank account. I can fly. Right? I will disappear from in front of you and reappear up above you, right? If I believe it passionately enough. The only reason that I haven't got the money yet and I can't fly is because I haven't mustered up enough, passion. That's the only reason. Most of us realize we believe things because we think they're true. But this picture of faith says, no, we make things true by believing in them. And if this is the picture we have of faith, of course you think, well, I don't have to listen to someone if this is what faith is. Just by a show of hands, this picture of faith, that faith is basically sticking your head in the sand like an ostrich. Faith is thinking whatever you like against rational considerations. Raise your hand if you heard this in common conversation, or it's a familiar enough concept that this isn't the first time you're hearing it, that you've already heard this kind of thing before. Show of hands. Okay, so not just the people I've seen. All right, well, let's continue with these authors. In explaining the absurdity that you need to have faith, right, because you can only believe something with faith if it's absurd. Otherwise, if it's rational, you don't need faith. You have reason. The authors continue. The more absurd the proposition, the more passionate the belief in it must be. Because the proposition that God became mortal is about as absurd as they come, Kierkegaard thinks that belief in it requires the maximum amount of passion. Now, if this is the way that a person interprets a philosopher of the stature of Kierkegaard, you interpret him so that he seems to be saying something ridiculous. You've probably made a mistake. Like, the rule of charity is basically, when you listen to people, you try to listen to what you think they're intending to say. It's easy enough in any kind of context, not just reading a book, but listening to people in conversation, to misconstrue what they're saying, to try to nitpick, find loopholes, and in that way, right, miss their point. Sometimes we do it intentionally, sometimes we do it out of malice, sometimes we do it out of stubbornness. But we can do this to books too. And so if a philosopher reads as if he's saying something silly, we're probably reading him wrong. Some commentators on Kierkegaard who read him wrong have said things like, well, okay, the eternal becomes temporal. That's absurd. But this is more absurd. God is a basketball. He's an alligator that can speak and got flushed down my toilet. But these are clearly more absurd than God becoming man, because they're not only temporal and finite, but also, what? Right? This is completely absurd. This is a way not to read. Now, what I'm going to do next is explain what it is that these people got wrong by talking a bit about what Kierkegaard was getting at. Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher, lived in a time in Europe when pretty much everybody in Denmark was Christian. He called it Christendom. He used this word in a derogatory fashion. Now, this was the idea. He would go to church on Sunday. He'd see the people who said, were Christian. They listened to the sermons. They sang the songs. Then they go about the rest of their lives as if it doesn't matter. The fact that God becomes man and saves us from sin doesn't really seem to have any effect on their lives. They just live their lives and they go to church because that's what you do. You're Danish. And it's, well, You're a Hoosier, you just go to church. This is just part of culture, right? It's like being born someplace. It's not actually something that you're assenting to and living. It's just part of your cultural identity. If you've ever heard of something like a cultural Catholic or an ethnic Jew, something like that, even though there's a deposit of faith or a faith passed on from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that originally give these people their identity as a religious people, you can still say, well, I'm a cradle Catholic, meaning, well, I was born into it, this is sort of my identity, but it doesn't necessarily mean you believe it. Well, what do you do when everyone around you says they're Christian, but very few of them actually mean it or even know what it means? And you can tell them, hey, this matters. Either it's true or it's false. If it's true, this is a big deal. If it's false, stop going to church. This is a waste of time. Yeah, I know. I'm a Christian. No, I mean it. It really matters. You need to accept this. It's how do you preach to the choir when the choir says, yeah, we're here, we showed up, but they really don't know what they're doing? So in response, Kierkegaard started picking up a lot of different tactics. One was he started writing under pseudonyms, right? Fake names. You've probably seen some pseudonyms in your time. Mark Twain, right? This is a pseudonym for Samuel Clemens. He writes under the pseudonym Mark Twain. George Eliot is a pseudonym. But when an author picks up a pseudonym, they write under someone else's name, or they come up with a name. They have different reasons for doing it. His reason was this. He thought, well, no one's going to listen to me. This is what I'll do. I'll pretend like I'm someone else who doesn't understand Christianity. I'll approach it as if I'm an alien anthropologist. I'll look at it from the outside and try to figure out, what does this thing mean? These Christians who come together and say certain things and believe certain things and do certain things. And in approaching it from the outside and pretending to be someone else, he thought, maybe I'll give someone another look on it. So when they open my book, they won't think, oh, another Christian telling me to be Christian. They'll think, oh, this is weird. I wonder what someone else thinks of Christianity. Well, one of the pseudonyms that he used, he called A. This was just his shorthand. And I'll sum up basically 2 books that he talked about. I'm talking about Kierkegaard because he's being grossly misrepresented by this textbook. So there's this book called Either Or. Maybe you've seen it in a bookstore before. This is how the entire book starts off. Kierkegaard said, I needed a desk for my study. I saw one in a thrift shop window, and I thought that would work for me. I bought it. I took it home, and I got busy with life. Now, eventually, I came back to the study. I started settling things in. I'm going to start using this desk now, and I started trying to open the drawers, and I realized I couldn't. They were locked. The previous owner hadn't given the key to the pawn shop owner, and so I had to eventually break it. And when I broke it open, imagine my surprise, I find all these journal notes. Started reading them. I felt a little guilty, like I'm looking into somebody's private diary, but I thought, well, who knows how old these are? Maybe they're long dead. I started to realize, well, maybe they're not. In fact, I might know one of these people. But as I compiled them, I realized that 2 people had owned this desk, and both of them had left their journal notes in it. One of them was, well, let's just call him the judge. He was a judge. And another one, well, he was a man who was independently wealthy. He got to spend his time as he liked. He was an aesthete, basically. Let's just call him A, to protect the innocent. And he writes these books to try to explain what Christianity looks like from the point of view of a rule follower like the judge, and what Christianity looks like from the point of view of basically a hedonist bohemian like the aesthete. And this book sells like hotcakes because the aesthete has some really scandalous stories that he writes about. Right? One of them is, he basically says, what's the root of all evil in the world? It's boredom. What were Adam and Eve doing before they were tempted and they succumbed? Probably nothing. They were bored. What were people doing before they built the Tower of Babel? Nothing. Bored. What are you doing before you think of something that you know you shouldn't do and decide to do it anyway? Battling boredom. So as an aesthete, he thinks the meaning of life is just to somehow make a game of everything. He says, this is how you can succeed in life. Try to figure out how to make everything enjoyable. Here's an example that might be relevant to what's happening right now. He said, I thought I'd go to this lecture series, and I thought it'd be great fun, but I got bored within 3 minutes. But luckily, I'm pretty ingenious. I figured out how to amuse myself. The speaker was this big, corpulent man, sweat a bunch. And the sweat came dripping down his face, and there'd be these little drops of sweat that when he spoke with a lot of passion and movement. The little droplets would sort of swirl on his nose, almost flying off. And he said, I made a game of it with myself to bet when would that glob of sweat pop off of his nose. And I don't know what he said that whole night, but I had great fun. Right? And this is how he says to spend life. So he thinks again later on, how do I spend, let's get a long-term project. Oh, I'll seduce a woman who's religious, who's only devoted to God. Right? And because of this story, this man who's trying to seduce a woman consecrated to God sells like hotcakes. Kierkegaard is really, really upset. No one's getting the point. They think this is just another gossip mag or a Harlequin romance or something. So another book he writes is this anthropologist who's looking at Christianity by a man named Johannes Climacus. He's actually taking the name of a saint and using it as his pseudonym. And this saint, looking from the outside in, says basically, I don't understand any of these doctrines that Christians say they believe. It must be absurd. But they still believe it, and it still seems to make a difference in their lives. Oh, this must be what faith is, belief in absurdity. Now, this person who's writing from the outside, trying to figure out Christianity, created by Kierkegaard to get through the thick heads of Christians who don't understand Christianity, is taken to mean this is what Christianity actually is to Christians. Right? So this fake person Kierkegaard uses to get through to Christians is taken by these textbook authors and used to say, oh, this is what faith is. Christians themselves say it. So this is one typical way that things are misrepresented. And this is kind of a serpentine, right, really complicated story. Things usually aren't that complicated, but you can imagine how easy it is just seeing the 30-second snippets of things on the television and in magazines about how faith can be misconstrued very, very quickly. Any questions about this so far? Now, what Kierkegaard meant in trying to look at Christianity from the point of view of this anthropologist on the outside looking in was something like this. The phrase truth as subjectivity pops up, right? The subjective. If I believe something subjectively, it's true. Objectively speaking, I can create all these interesting castles in the sky with my thought. But if I don't really invest myself in them, they don't mean anything. Again, this is all Climacus talking, the person who doesn't get it. He says, all right, so they come up with this weird structure. It doesn't seem like it should be able to hold together like a castle floating in the sky. But they really commit themselves to it. And that must be what truth is, at least for these Christians. Now, in the overall corpus of Kierkegaard's works, he has things called the upbuilding discourses. He writes these in his own name, and he's clear about what he's trying to get at. He basically says, this is what I'm getting at. We are subjects. We have the ability to experience the world. The things we experience are objects of our experience, right? We are a subject that is an object. Our words today, be subjective or be objective, right? They draw from this classical understanding of being a subject who can experience objects. This is the problem. If there's a thing that's true in the world, and I don't ever turn towards it to attempt to understand it so that it can change my life, it may as well not exist. So an example I use in some of my classes is, take for instance my 2-year-old daughter, Lucy. She's figured a lot of stuff out, but she hasn't quite figured out gravity. Well, she gets it enough, she can run, she knows how to hold her body up, she knows kind of what happens when she leaps off of things, but not exactly. She's kind of a daredevil. And luckily, we're typically there to catch her. And when we're not, she slams into a wall and she cries for like 2 seconds, and then she gets up and runs around some more. So she's pretty hard-headed. That's helpful for her, but she doesn't really seem to learn what's going on. But this is an objective truth about the world, whether she realizes it or not. Gravity is real. She is something that has mass, and as such, she's attracted to other things that have mass. like the earth. And it doesn't matter if she never understands it, it still affects her. Right? So it behooves her to turn her attention to the nature of the world she lives in so that she can see what it is and then change her behavior because of it. This is what Kierkegaard means when he says truth is subjectivity. Not that you can make things true just by believing in them, but the truths that are already there, whether you believe them or not, can't affect you until you turn towards them to know them. And so God is going to exist whether I believe in him or not. Believing in him doesn't make him pop into existence. It makes it possible for me to have a relationship with him. Disbelieving won't make him disappear. It just means I can't have a relationship. And this is the same with everything else in the world. Like my wife. Believing in her did not make her appear, and disbelieving won't make her disappear. It'll just mean I will have a functional or dysfunctional marriage. This is what subjectivity means for Kierkegaard. And this is where faith comes in. Faith is a matter of trust. This is the idea. Faith is a kind of pointing yourself in a direction with the expectation that there is going to be something there to see. I'll talk about this a little more, but I want to read from St. Augustine of Hippo and St. Anselm of Canterbury to make this point in words better than my own. So here is a theologian talking about faith and reason. St. Anselm of Canterbury. This is in a work called the Proslogion, and if you've ever read it, you'll notice from the very beginning, it's not a simple treatise. This is what I think, XYZ. It's a meditation. It's actually a prayer. The entire thing begins with this despairing call to God. I've been made to love you. I've never seen you. What is that about? How can I know that I love you if I've never known you? I want to know what this means. I want to know you. This is how chapter 1 ends. He's gotten over his immediate despair and he's sort of settling in. I acknowledge, Lord, and I thank you, that you have created in me this image of you so that I may remember you, think of you, and love you. Yet this image is so eroded by my vices, so clouded by the smoke of my sins, that it cannot do what it was created to do unless you renew and refashion it. I am not trying to scale your heights, Lord. My understanding is no equal to that. But I do long to understand your truth in some way, your truth which my heart believes and loves. For I do not seek to understand in order to believe. I believe in order to understand. For I also believe that unless I believe, I shall not understand. The idea being, if I don't think there's some truth outside of me that I can know by turning myself towards it and listening, in humility realizing I don't know everything, there's no chance I can come to know the thing. But there's a very subtle change in the way it sounds between saying, I believe so that I understand, I have faith so that I can come to know the thing, and saying, I believe it so that I can make it true. They sound very similar, but there's the world of difference. The second one is, just by my sheer willing, I change the world and what's true in it. The first one means, by sheer willing, I can admit that I don't know, turn towards the world, and in that way open myself up to its truth. One more reading. This is from St. Augustine of Hippo, from his Confessions. I could have written all this out, but I like having the books on hand. And you never know who's going to have a question, and I can look up something else in the book. This is St. Augustine. Thou dost so excite him to praise, thou dost so excite him that to praise thee is his joy. Just for a moment, if you don't know this, thee sounds really high and sort of King James-ish, right? We're used to hearing thee, meaning older English. Thee actually was the intimate form of the word you. So when someone uses the word thee, it's like talking to to dad as opposed to father. It's like talking to mom instead of mother. So when you hear the word thee, you have in your heads an echo of real intimacy here. For thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless till they rest in thee. Grant me, O Lord, to know which is the soul's first movement toward you, to implore thy aid, or to utter its praise of thee, and whether it must know thee before it can implore. For it would seem clear that no one can call upon thee without knowing thee. For if he did, he might invoke another than thee, knowing thee not. Zeus? I don't know. Yet may it be that a man must implore thee before he can know thee. But how shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? Or how shall they believe without a preacher? And they shall praise the Lord that seek him. For those that seek shall find, and finding him, they will praise him. Let me seek thee, Lord, by praying thy aid, and let me utter my prayer believing in thee, for thou hast been preached to us. And he continues on. But this is the first paragraph. And it's not someone who's advanced, he is advanced in the faith, but he's not beginning at his advanced stage with his autobiography. He's saying something that most people can understand. This is one of the oddities about life. And you don't have to think about God. Again, you can think about anything like a marriage. I don't know this person yet, but I know her enough to know that I want to have a lifelong commitment. What sense does that make? Well, I know enough to know that in pointing myself towards her, I can learn something that will help me understand what I'm supposed to be. You can blow this up to our biggest question. How do you know who God is enough to know that you want him? Or to know that you're in the right ballpark when people are telling you things about him? Or that if he ever has direct communication with you, that's God? It seems like we're stuck in this little rut. How can you know something? How can you seek it unless you know it in the first place? But why would you seek it unless you already knew it? This is why faith and understanding are often misunderstood. Now, any questions about faith? I'm going to move to reason next. All right. Modern counterfeits of reason. Reason's the same thing as science. And this is where we get the whole science versus religion rehash in a lot of media outlets. Here's a problem with this conception. When people say reason's the same thing as science, don't believe that, you're being irrational. Typically what they mean is they have in mind the counterfeit picture of faith that we talked about earlier. Faith is believing whatever I want. And reason, science is their byword for reason and vice versa, they're synonymous. It's just a reaction to irrationality, but it doesn't really have any common content, any concrete content. And so someone could say, well, science says, a study said, this is statistically proven. And typically what this means is if you ask them about it, they read half an article on Wikipedia, or they saw a headline. They don't know what the headline was telling of in the story, but they saw something said, and so science says. In many cases, an appeal to reason by people today, not by all people, but people who misunderstand it, is a very sloppy appeal to authority. Right? There are proper appeals to authority and improper appeals. If you want to know what the church says about certain things in morals, you ask someone who is an expert in that. If you want to figure out whether someone was lying when he said he was doing 80 miles an hour before stepping on his brakes, you call in ballistics experts who can look at the tread marks, they know rules about momentum and rubber and so on. You call the appropriate expert. But it would be odd to call in a priest who has no ballistics training to talk about a court case about tire tread marks. And just as odd to bring in a ballistics expert who has no theological training to talk about moral issues in the church. So there can be proper appeals to authority, but there's also improper appeals to authority. Well, one of the problems with improper appeals to authority when we talk about science, right? Science, it's like they said. Science says. What do you mean? Particular people in science? Which ones? Which scientists? Are they geneticists? Are they talking about genetics? Are they physicists? Are they talking about physics? So this is one problem. Typically, this is an appeal against someone who seems to be using faith in the wrong fashion. Faith meaning I can believe it whatever I want, and someone else saying, well, there's an expert out there who said something else, and he has credentials. So this isn't really reason. This is kind of a facade that can serve the purpose of reason in some small capacity. If you have two people speaking about faith and reason, both of them not knowing what they mean. The other problem with this appeal, let's say you know someone who understands what science is and knows properly how to appeal to scientific authority and studies and conclusions and interpretations of data. Science is not equivalent to reason. It is one particular application of reason. And as a particular application of reason, it's actually smaller than reason, if you're going to think about fields of study. Everything you do where you inquire into the nature of things and realize those things have a truth that you have to agree to, you can't change by disbelieving, you are using reason. This is true in your English classes. When you're figuring out how language is telling you about relationships, you're getting a picture into the human condition when you read these great works. You're using this in science, yeah. You're using it in math. But science is only one application of reason. And so when you try to equate reason with one of its applications, you do two things. You make reason smaller, and so misunderstand it by the distortion. And you make science bigger, and you misunderstand that by the distortion. Now, one of the consequences of this dual misunderstanding, if you think that they're the same thing, is first you become blind to the role that faith plays in the exercise of reason. One example of this would be the use of first principles, or let's say axioms in mathematics. Now, raise your hand if you've ever taken a geometry class. About half people, a little more than half? Okay. So if I said a point is a location in space, you'd know what I'm talking about. A line segment are all those lines between two given points in a plane, all that stuff. But so we have certain things we can define, like a line segment, I just did it. A line segment are all those points between two given points in a plane. A circle, all those points equidistant from a given point in a plane. Okay, well, what's a point? Is that a location in space, I guess? I mean, can I get a smaller word? Like a dot? I don't know. Points are just given. If you understand the concept, you just go. We can define things like circles and lines and triangles in terms of the smaller things that we start with, the axioms, the first principles. But those first principles themselves cannot be defined by the things that come after. They're just the things you have to start with. This doesn't mean they're irrational. It just means you can't explain them, because they're the standard that you use to measure everything that comes after them. This is true in every application of reason. Every field in which you apply rational thought, you are starting with some kind of assumption. The assumption could be true or it could be false. But it's the kind of thing that when you start with it, you can't explain with the reasoning that's going to come afterward. Right? Think of any game you play. It has a lot of rules, right? When you start playing the game, you can realize whether someone's going against the rules. That's fine. But the rules themselves are not going to you can't explain why the rule is there. The rule is just there. This is sort of the idea. This is how reason works. You have to have starting material before you can actually start playing a game with it, before you can start to figure out how they go together in licit or illicit configurations. And so, if you don't understand that science and reason are separate, you'll be more likely to misunderstand the fact that science, as I said, relies on basically faith in first principles. You just have to accept certain things are true if this system is going to work. One of the other problems you have, if this is your misunderstanding of reason, is that you may not necessarily know that reason is binding. If someone can say, well, I reasoned to this conclusion, and someone else says, well, yeah, but that's how you think. This is an immediate signal that the person doesn't understand how reason works. You can say, your first principles are false, therefore your conclusion is false, even though it was derived validly. But that's different from saying, the structure of reason itself doesn't apply to me. Right? Reason always applies to everyone. The question is, what are the first principles people are assuming? And given those first principles, what conclusions are they drawing? So you can tell someone, I don't accept the conclusion, but if they've actually applied reason properly, you can't say it's because, well, reason doesn't apply to me. You can only say that the first principles that themselves cannot be established through reason are false. This is a lot to take in, I know, because it usually takes me a week and a half to teach these concepts in logic. So if you're sort of just getting the gist of it, I think that's all right for now. But right before I move to this next point, a quick plug for our department. We're teaching philosophy of religion, introduction to Catholic theology in the spring, and if you're ever interested in logic, we do offer that. So look for those in the course catalog. Now, I want to read a couple examples of what happens when people misunderstand reason. Start with C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters. Again, if you have taken one of my ethics classes, this may look familiar. If you don't know the Screwtape Letters, this is a fictional set of correspondence that C.S. Lewis wrote. It's written from one demon to another. An uncle demon who's giving advice to his nephew who's new to tempting somebody. He's trying to teach him how to tempt people successfully. And if you're not quite sure why you've heard the name C.S. Lewis before, or maybe you do know the name, his most famous works today are the Chronicles of Narnia. They've been made into movies. But he's a famous apologist. He was a medieval Renaissance scholar at Oxford. And he wrote this book. This is the beginning of the book, chapter 1, page 1. My dear Wormwood, I note what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend. Materialism, in a philosophical sense, means you only think that matter exists. There's no other such things as spirits or anything. It's just the physical world is all there is. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you supposed that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches, the enemy being God. That might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not. And if it was proved, they really believed it. They still connected thinking with doing and were prepared to alter their way of life as the result of a chain of reasoning. But what with the weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. Your man has been accustomed ever since he was a boy to have a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside his head. He doesn't think of doctrines primarily as true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or ruthless. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Don't waste time trying to make him think that materialism is true. Make him think it is strong, or stark, or courageous, or the philosophy of the future. That's the sort of thing he cares about. He goes on. All right, think about the kind of justifications people often give for some conclusion that they're holding against other people. It's usually for these reasons. Well, it's convenient, it's efficient, it makes, right? It's true. When's the last time you had a discussion with someone where you had a disagreement and the person appealed to the truth of the thing as the reason why you should believe, as opposed to something else, like the jargon that Screwtape talks about here? Now, if his advice to Wormwood sounds familiar. Again, I think this is just C.S. Lewis ringing the bell of the time. If it rings true, it's because this is what people think about today with regard to reason. And in short, they don't. They don't really know what reason is. In the same chapter, a couple of pages later, he says, you know, I once had a patient like yours. I had a confirmed atheist. I had him in my hands for 20 years. And I started noticing once when he was sitting in the library reading his books, a line of reasoning developing that I did not like. And I knew it was going to be all for nothing if I didn't step in. Did I argue with him? No. I suggested, you know what? Maybe it's time for lunch. And by the time I got him out at the door, he looked at a bus and a newsboy, and he thought, that's real life, right? I saw a bus, and I saw a guy giving papers, and that's real life. Whatever you see in classes, whatever you figure out on your own time in your study with your books, that's all in your head. That's fake. That's imaginary. If we can use this jargon to talk about the nature of reason, which is always binding, we can dismiss lines of reasoning because all that sort of thing is well and good insofar as it goes, but it's not real life, by which we probably mean the bill sitting on our kitchen counter, right? How does the fact that I have bills to pay have anything to do with whether a certain line of reasoning is true or false? It doesn't. But this is the typical way we think about things. We use things as excuses for not having to reason. One other passage from another book by C.S. Lewis. This is from The Abolition of Man. In this book, C.S. Lewis is taking on basically a philosophy of the 20th century that says, well, value is a passing thing, right? Value meaning faith, which means believe whatever you like. Basically, Christianity is superstition that's left over, that you just believe it because your parents told you to. What we need is the future. What we need is science. What we need is value-free thinking. Because values are nothing other than our arbitrary decision to like certain things and not like other things. The C.S. Lewis tries in this book to say that actually this picture of value is mistaken. I'll start reading. If my duty to my parents is a superstition, then so is my duty to posterity. If justice is a superstition, then so is my duty to my country or my race. If the pursuit of scientific knowledge is a real value, then so is conjugal fidelity. What he's saying here, let's go through them one at a time, is let's say, for instance, someone saying, well, these are the ways that you think because that's how you were raised. But this is really what you are, a set of neurons firing, physiological systems, etc. So get rid of your old outmoded views of justice about whatever it is you think is just with regard to human sexuality or use of your wealth. Instead, think about what's good for the race, right? You're a human being, Homo sapiens. You have a biology that we can look at and study. If my duty to my parents is a superstition, so then is my duty to posterity. In other words, why should I care about the future of the human race as a biological species if I don't care about my parents? If I can dispense with whatever value my parents have told me about the world, why should I think posterity is not going to do the same thing to me? They're two sides of the same coin. And saying you can get rid of traditional value because it's just outmoded superstition, you're not doing anything other than preaching a new value, but you're blind to the fact that that's what you're doing. All you're saying is, I don't like that value, I want another value. But you're not saying, be rational. Look at one of the other examples he gives here. If the pursuit of scientific knowledge is a real value, then so is conjugal fidelity. That one may be a little more difficult to understand, but this is the idea. Here is something that the scientific method assumes, but it cannot prove. But it relies on this assumption being assumed to be true to do its work. The universe is uniform. If I do an experiment here, someone else in Australia can also do it, and if he has the same conditions as I had, he can reproduce my results. Doesn't matter where you are in the universe, the assumption is given the same physical conditions, the same thing should happen. This isn't proven. It's just assumed. Cannot be proven. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's just we need to be clear. This is an assumption that you need to make the scientific method work. I don't even have to talk about Australia. If I do the same thing tomorrow, why should I expect it to happen again if I do it the same way? Again, I have an assumption that the universe, not only spatially but temporally, is uniform. That things are going to be the same tomorrow as they are today under the same conditions. They might not be. The sky might turn purple tomorrow for no explicable reason, because it might not be true that the universe is uniform. But again, this is the assumption we just keep in mind if the scientific method is going to go anywhere. What does this have to do with conjugal fidelity? Well, maybe the picture's becoming clearer, right? We have faith in a universe that will never turn its back on us, that will not change, that will not leave us behind, that will always be what it always has been. And this is what conjugal fidelity is, only not towards the universe, but to a person. The same thing that undergirds the scientific method, which is good, but it's not the same as reason, is the same thing that undergirds our understanding of the value of the fidelity of marriage, which is a form of faith. Now, how do these go together? As I said before, I'm not going to go over the Catholic tradition on faith and reason. It's done better than I could hope to do it, and I'm not going to try to summarize it either. I'll give you a sort of a thumbnail sketch of a way of thinking about faith and reason in productive ways that would be a good foot in the door for understanding the Catholic tradition, and in any case will be very good correctives for the degenerate forms of faith we have today, meaning just believe whatever I like, and reason, meaning, I don't know, some nebulous reference to an authority that I really don't know about. If you understand knowing as a relationship, then faith is that disposition of intellect which enables knowing, and reason is the character of knowing. And again, I talked about this metaphor before, but I'll bring it up again. Faith is the movement of my intellect to forget about itself and aim outward towards something else. This is trust. The assumption is it's going to get something by being aimed at something. Reason is the character of the relationship that I establish after I've aimed myself at something. Now, they're always going to go together because of this. This is an imperfect metaphor, but if you think of it in terms of, let's say, a grappling gun, right? Faith is my ability to aim. I don't know what it's going to grab. I'm aiming in the dark, let's say. And reason is the tether and the hook. Whatever it figures out, whenever it connects to something, that's the nature of my relationship in this crude metaphor. I'm somehow connected to this thing through this line. So when you know things through reason, when you come to conclusions, when you infer through logically valid rules, what you are doing is focusing your attention on the nature of the world around you, on particular truths about the world. So when you're studying biology, you're not downloading a bunch of facts into your brain like you're a hard drive. You are focusing your attention on some particular aspect of God's creation, which reflects his nature as its creator. You are focusing your attention on something, and in that focusing, if ever you come to know, knowledge is the word we have for the relationship you have established with this part of the world. So if you understand, say, the blood clot cascade of chemicals that makes fluid blood turn into a scab, you are given certain words and symbols that we've come up with to refer to these things about the world. But you're focused on that part of the world and what's true about it. So it may feel like you're trying to download facts, but you're actually establishing a relationship. And like every other relationship, it follows the same rules. The more you pay attention to people that you have relationships with, the easier it is to develop them. When you don't pay attention to people, those relationships atrophy and they die. Right? You can think about any friends you might have had from high school or grade school. Not that you ever had a big falling out, that could have happened too, but maybe you have friends that you don't have friends, you're not friends with anymore just because you stop seeing each other, don't have as much in common. whatever the case, the relationship fades because you two aren't attending to each other as objects of your experience. And this is what faith and reason are. Faith is a turning toward, and reason is the nature of the way that we grasp things when we grasp things in a relationship. Whether it be actual relationships with people or the relationships that we call knowing. All right. I want to thank you. And if there are any questions or comments, now is the time. Tom.
You spoke about the modern counterfeits of faith. You illustrated your point by reading from a philosophy textbook, and you showed pretty clearly the authors of that textbook were misinterpreting Kierkegaard. But clearly, it's a bigger point than the interpretation of this one author, Kierkegaard. So I'd like to ask if you have any notion of where these textbook authors might be getting this.
Well, this view of Kierkegaard is common. So I think he was misunderstood from the beginning. As I mentioned, his readers didn't get it. If you go to your typical bookstore, if it has just a passing philosophy section, I mean, typically nowadays you'll find a bunch of Nietzsche, and that's about it. You won't find a lot of philosophy. But if you ever find Kierkegaard, it'll be either or is going to be on the shelf. But almost no one stocks his upbuilding discourses. I think one of the reasons Kierkegaard in particular is typically misunderstood by anthologizers and people who try to sum up the history of philosophy is that the upbuilding discourses are clearly about Christianity. And so that doesn't count as philosophy, that's theology. But the other books that Kierkegaard writes, he was heavily influenced by Hegel, Hegel's picture of history. Kierkegaard considered himself one of the great critics of Hegel. His big critique of Hegel was basically, great system, Hegel. What does it do? How do we connect to it? How do you plug in and live in that castle? And so people read Kierkegaard as a response to Hegel, and in that way he's sort of preserved in the history of philosophy. But since he talks about Christianity so much, you can't get away from it. And so they have to deal with what do you do with this faith stuff that keeps popping up. And since they don't read the other half, because it's off the radar, they always misunderstand what he's saying. Luckily, there's good Kierkegaard scholars who correct the point, but it's typically not the experts on particular philosophers who themselves become sort of general, anthologizers. Sure, go ahead.
I had the impression that these authors were attracted to a certain interpretation of Kierkegaard because they had already formed certain notions about what faith means. And so this is what I meant by the point being bigger.
Yeah, I think that's true too, that they already think this is what faith is, so that's how they will interpret when they see someone talk. Is that what you're saying?
And do you have some thought about where they might have gotten this notion of what faith means from some other source than Kierkegaard?
Yes. Actually, this is why I bring the textbook. I don't know what questions are coming up. The short answer is Bertrand Russell. He is the hero of the story for these textbook authors. So in contrast to Kierkegaard, who says, you know what, the more absurd, the better. That means I have to have more passion. In contrast to this person, we have Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was a mathematician and philosopher in the 20th, most of his work in the 20th century. He was British and pretty influential in the work he did both in philosophy and mathematics. Let's see if I can find, here we go. So this is how they rebut Kierkegaard, and I think it's Russell that gave him their idea of what faith looks like. This is a blot quotation from Russell himself. There is something feeble and a little contemptible about a man who cannot face the perils of life without the help of comfortable myths. Almost inevitably, some part of him is aware that they are myths, and he believes them only because they're comforting. But he dare not face this thought, and he therefore cannot carry his own reflections to any logical conclusion. Moreover, since he is aware, however dimly, that his opinions are not rational, he becomes furious when they are disputed. He therefore adopts persecution, censorship, and a narrowly cramping education as essentials of statecraft. Insofar as he is successful, he produces a population which is timid and unadventurous and incapable of progress. Pretty strong words. And I love this. This is how the authors sum up the battle they've now posed between Kierkegaard and Russell. Rather than admiring those who believe something when there is no good evidence for it, Russell despises them. Because they can't support their view by reason, they have to resort to force and violence. Such people, Russell says, do not make the world a better place. Well, insulting to the intelligence for college students, but college textbook. Thanks for the question. Other questions? Yes. Could you tell me your name?
Mary?
Mary, thanks.
I had a question about when you were talking about thoughts, how when you're thinking that's imagination or made up, how, like, I think I didn't understand it very well because, like, how do you figure into that things like prayer or contemplative thought, where it's in solitude, but there is a certain reality to it, even though it's not like a physical object, let's say.
Sure. Yeah. What Screwtape was trying to say to his nephew was, you get people to just pay attention to the constant stream of experience that they're having all the time. Call that real life, whatever that is, right? A bus, a football game, whatever it is, the bill on my kitchen table. Call that real life. We have the ability to focus our attention on truths with our minds, and it doesn't require us to have a constant stream of stimuli. So what you're saying is actually what Screwtape is fighting. Yeah, the things that I figure out in the privacy of my own study can be real and binding for everybody. In the same way, the relationship that I am developing, establishing, and growing in prayer is real. It doesn't matter if no one can see it, if it actually is being established. Is that what you were getting at?
I think so.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of new ideas for me that I'm trying to grasp that one. I want to make sure I understood.
Okay. Yeah, and again, this is the problem. Screwtape has a lot of fun with this. But the relationship I have with, say, my wife, it requires me to pay attention to her. It would be odd if I never thought about her or tried to figure out what she's like or ask her questions. This is my love turning into understanding. This is what Anselm says when he says, I believe so that I may come to understand. The same thing happens with God. This is the faith that we have, and it also grows. So this is just as real as any other relationship I have, as long as there's a person there that's having this relationship with me. I saw your hand. Could you tell me your name? Brett?
Brett, yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry for the oversimplification. I know you mentioned that all science is reason, but not all reason is based on science and the scientific method. Could you give some,
And this is 15 minutes.
Oh, sure.
practical, reason-based issues that are not based in science or the scientific method?
Sure. The word science is going to be slippery for us. But typically, what people mean by science, when they use it in a sloppy way, is physics, biology, chemistry, those fields and their subdisciplines, which are typically today making news because of advances in technology and medicine. Science, classically understood, didn't necessarily mean just those things. It was a particular kind of knowledge. But as I said, science is one application of reason, which is the sort of larger generic thing that's happening when you do science. So mathematics, for instance, right? We can call it a science, but typically people can see sort of the distinction between math and, say, biology. The main difference is all of the hard sciences, which again are working because, if we weren't figuring things out through our application of the scientific method, there'd be no way of explaining our technological advancement. So it's good, it's working, it's doing something. But all of these physical sciences are based on statistical probability because they're empirical. Mathematics has as one of its subcategories statistics and probability. And this subcategory of mathematics is what science uses to say whether certain interpretations of data are reliable. But yeah, if you've ever, say, taken any classes in like psychology or sociology, they have a lot of statistical classes. They see that their studies are based on math. A lot of the studies in physics and biology and chemistry, researchers realize how much statistics they have to use, but they'll become aware of the fact that physics isn't just physics, but it's based on something that's higher than it, namely mathematics. Mathematics and reason come closer to being the same umbrella. I don't know if this is helping any.
Maybe a practical reasoning issue that is not based in the science or scientific method.
Okay. Well, here's one that's still empirical, but we wouldn't consider this a scientific study. Lawyers' arguments in court. Right, when they will, I typically use this one because a lot of people will say, have you seen Legally Blonde? Raise your hand if you have not seen this movie, Legally Blonde. Okay, a lot of people have seen it. It doesn't require an expert on all things chemical to realize if someone's in the shower, and so she says this is the reason she couldn't have heard a gunshot, but she still has a perm, and so she couldn't have been in the shower. This person is lying. Right, this is the application of the principle of non-contradiction. Either you were in the shower or you weren't. If you were in the shower, you couldn't have heard the gunshot, but you wouldn't have a perm. If you were out of the shower, it would explain your perm, but it wouldn't explain why you didn't hear the gunshot. When we look at someone and say, hey, you come into the party? No, I've got work to do. And you find out the next week that somebody saw him at the movies. Right? You realize he can't be in two places at once. He lied about going home to work. Anytime we apply the law of non-contradiction, we don't have to be scientists. We don't have specific research fields that we're working in. We're using reason in this way. Here's another example. This is a syllogism. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This is just an understanding of how classes work. Right? The class of things that are mortal. Socrates is a member of that class. He's a member of the class of men, which are a part of the bigger class of things that are mortal. So again, this is another example of how we can use reason, and we do it all the time. We just don't think about it because it comes so naturally to us. Is this helping? Give some examples.
I would look at that as science of rhetoric or science of logic. I mean, there are certain other sciences besides biological science, science of law. You mentioned I just was trying to work it through in my mind of how things can be reasonable or not based in some essentially scientific method, how things are looked at.
Sure.
I know you mentioned that science was not just all reason. There's faith-based in science. You have faith in your initial premises, a lot of the initial premises that we don't understand, to take you forward, to look toward them. But that's why I meant by oversimplification. All science is reason, but not all reason is such science.
Yeah. Yes, the theoretical basis of science are these things like, first, on one hand, statistics of mathematics, and on the other hand, these classes that you might have called rhetoric or logic. We call it logic when we study it in philosophy. But these are the rules of reason. So logic would be, I suppose, for us, synonymous. Yep. Thanks for that question. Other questions? Joe, thanks.
In Catholic teaching, the ultimate goal is to see the compatibility of faith and reason. And the Catholic Church's teaching is, we see that within all cultures there's this natural desire to be people of faith. And Thomas Aquinas talks about we're naturally born with atheism, and sometimes we have to be educated into atheism. Do you see that as a credible view?
Question, Ms. Lewis.
So do I see it as a credible view, the Catholic Church's insistence that it's not just our particular tradition that sees the complementarity of faith and reason?
We are born with a natural belief in God, and then we discover why it's reasonable to have that faith.
In a generic sense, yes, I think that is the view of the Church, that this is just how we're built. Yeah. Some people get to it better than others, and not all faiths have the same content because they're not all aimed at the same things. And this might be something that distinguishes one person from another, one set of beliefs from another. But the fact that all wish to inquire shows the same innate structure of the human mind. We all want to reason. We look for it, and even when we come to different conclusions, the fact is, why is it you're the kind of thing that sought out a reason in the first place? Yeah, good question. Other questions? All right, well, I want to thank you for visiting with me this Saturday afternoon. Have a good day for the rest of the day and a good weekend.